13.2, we're going to be looking at biotic and abiotic factors in ecosystems. So to start with, we should know what biotic and abiotic mean. These are both vocabulary words from the section. Anytime you hear of something and it is biotic, that means it's alive. Anytime you hear the word abiotic and it's talking about something, that means it's not alive. So looking at this picture below, I'd like you to pause the video and make a list of all the abiotic and biotic factors you see in this particular picture. You have a little bit of space to the left of this picture in your notes where you can list some of those living and non-living things. By this point, you should have listed some non-living and living things, or biotic and abiotic things, on your paper. Here are some things that I may have listed myself. Flowers, turtles, fish, dragonflies. We'll say those are ladybugs, but I'm not so sure. We'll just call them ladybugs. Frogs, deer, raccoons, hawks, pine trees, grass, ferns. We'll call those water weeds. Lily pads, cattails. A lot of living things in this picture. How about some of the abiotic or non-living things? Well, there's the water, that's non-living. There's the dirt underneath this grass, there's dirt there. There's the sun, and what does the sun give off? Heat. So this picture, if you were there, there would be a temperature. Temperature is non-living. That's an abiotic factor that influences these organisms for sure. You could also say wind. Wind is certainly something that would be present in this environment, and wind is abiotic. This area probably would receive some form of rain or precipitation. That's abiotic. So there's a pretty decent list of some abiotic things as well. If there's any of those that you should list, please make sure you get those down before moving on. Next, we're going to be talking about biodiversity, which is another vocab word. Biodiversity refers to how many different species live in one particular area. And there are regions on our planet that have a lot of life living in that area, and there are ecosystems that don't have a lot of life living in their particular area. So looking at the world right here, what ecosystems or what parts of the planet would you expect most life to live, or which would have the highest level of biodiversity? And why? Well, take a second, think about it. Where would we find the most living things on our planet? Well, 80% of all living things on our planet live right about here, which is the equator, which makes a lot of sense. It's warm there year-round. It doesn't get very cold, and it's easier for life to live where it's warm than where it's cold. And if there's a lot of living things here, then that means that there's going to be the ability of a lot of predators to live there because they'll have food. And looking at the continents, we can see a lot of green there, and as we move around, there's a lot over there and over here. And that means that there's going to be a lot of plants. Well, if there's a lot of plants, that's where most food chains start. So if there's plants, there's animals and insects that can feed on those. And then there would be the top level predators that could eat those. So 80% of all life on our planet lives right across that equator. What type of ecosystems would hold the least biodiversity, and why? Well, what happens as we start to move north and we start to move south? We start to see that green slowly start to disappear, and it becomes a bit more dry, as we can see by these tan regions. Well, if it's tan, not going to be a lot of plants there, which means that there's not going to be a whole lot of organisms that can survive there in general, because plants form the base of almost all food chains. How about up here where we get to the poles, where it's completely white? Can living things survive there? Well, yes, they can. We talked about this in class not too long ago. The largest living thing that can live in Antarctica year-round are little tiny insects that are very, very small, 5 millimeters in length. That's not very big. Why? Because they don't have a lot of food sources. If there's not a lot of food sources, life can't survive there. Also, why can't life survive in these regions, the North and South Pole? Well, most living things aren't adapted to surviving in those extreme cold climates. Some can, but most can't. And the last thing we're going to touch on in 13.2 is what a keystone species is. Let's start by looking at this picture. It's of a doorway, so to speak, and it's pointing to the keystone right there. What would happen to all of these if we removed that one block and just moved it out? Well, all of the rest of the blocks, they would crumble and fall. That's a keystone. Keystones keep everything else balanced and in order. And the same applies to a keystone species. It's a species that has an unusually large effect on its ecosystem, and the removal of that keystone species, like the removal of this block, would cause everything else to crumble. So let's check out a keystone species on our next slide. Happen to be beavers. Beavers are a keystone species. Keystone species, they increase biodiversity and they allow everything else to kind of live balanced. So let's check out some ways that beavers increase biodiversity. Well, keep in mind, we know that beavers build dams in water beds, which creates some still water. So there's not going to be a lot of water movement behind the beaver dam. So as a result of beavers, there is a greater number and a wider variety of fish that are able to survive in those still waters. So that means that instead of having, say, 2 species of fish, there could be a wider variety. There could be like 10 species of fish. So there's more types of fish that can survive in that slowed water region. As a result of all those fish being there, that's going to attract birds that eat those fish. So we'll attract more life as a result of having this life. An example of birds that feed on fish are herons. Also, in still waters, that provides an excellent breeding ground for insects. So you're going to have a lot more insects in these types of environments. They can breed in the water, which is how mosquitoes do, or some species will breed and survive in the dead wood created by the beaver dam, which you can see a pile of dead wood here. That provides a food source and kind of a home for the insects as well. What is going to be attracted to this region because of the insects? Birds. Birds eat a lot of insects, so we're going to have a higher number of birds in this region as well. So that's what a keystone species is. It creates a stable environment. It increases biodiversity, or it increases the amount of living things in that particular environment. The last section on your notes that I'm looking for you to do is make a prediction of what you will think will happen to each of these bullet points if beavers were to go extinct. So take a few moments, and I want you to put some good thought into each of these bullets. What do you think will happen if beavers go extinct? All right. There's going to be a follow-up assignment to this going over biotic and abiotic factors. So make sure you have a good grip on what those 2 words